We can go ahead and get started. If you all want to turn in your copy of God's Word to Psalm 38. We'll be looking at all of Psalm 38 this evening. This is a Psalm of David. For the memorial offering, hear the word of the Lord. O Lord, rebuke me not in your anger, nor discipline me in your wrath. For your arrows have sunk into me, and your hand has come down on me. There is no soundness in my flesh because of your indignation. There is no health in my bones because of my sin. For my iniquities have gone over my head. Like a heavy burden, they are too heavy for me. My wounds stink and fester because of my foolishness. I am utterly bowed down and prostrate. All the day I go about mourning, for my sides are filled with burning, and there is no soundness in my flesh. I am feeble and crushed. I groan because of the tumult of my heart. O Lord, all my longing is before you. My sighing is not hidden from you. My heart throbs, my strength fails me, and the light of my eyes, it also has gone from me. My friends and companions stand aloof from my plague, and my nearest kin stand far off. Those who seek my life lay their snares. Those who seek my hurt speak of ruin and meditate treachery all day long. But I am like a deaf man. I do not hear, like a mute man who does not open his mouth. I have become like a man who does not hear, in whose mouth are no rebukes. But for you, O Lord, do I wait. It is you, O Lord my God, who will answer. For I said, only let them not rejoice over me who boast against me when my foot slips. For I am ready to fall, and my pain is ever before me. I confess my iniquity. I am sorry for my sin. But my foes are vigorous. They are mighty, and many are those who hate me wrongfully. Those who render me evil for good accuse me because I follow after good. Do not forsake me, O Lord. O my God, be not far from me. Make haste to help me, O Lord, my salvation. This is one of what is often referred to as a penitential psalm. We have 8 penitential psalms, including this one. We've looked at 2 of them thus far, Psalm 6, Psalm 32, Psalm 38, Psalm 51, Psalm 102, Psalm 130, and Psalm 143 are what are called penitential psalms, where the psalmist is confessing sin. He's showing contrition over his sin and asking for the Lord's forgiveness. And this psalm here begins like a previous penitential psalm that we've already gone through in Psalm 6. It's the exact same language of Psalm 6:1 as we get here in Psalm 38:1, which causes many to believe and say perhaps it is the same occasion in David's life that brings out both psalms, with Psalm 6 coming later because of the confident assertion at the end of Psalm 6, the Lord has heard my plea, versus here what we see is this theme of David concluding this psalm as he's waiting on the Lord. So I think it's good to read Psalm 6 and Psalm 38 sort of in correlation with one another. Psalm 6 perhaps after the Lord has heard David and has brought something that is clear to him as an answer to his prayer and to his pleas for mercy. Whereas Psalm 38, he's in this disposition of waiting at the end. Note the heading of the psalm, a psalm of David for the memorial offering. Within the offerings offered to God, there are occasions. We see it in Leviticus and other places in Numbers. There are occasions where the offerer would offer an extra memorial offering to the Lord. And this often came through an offerer sort of placing frankincense, say, on the grain offering that he would offer to God. But oftentimes, this sort of extra memorial offering would follow the sin offering for atonement. and essentially crying out to the Lord with this memorial offering, hear my confession of sin, remember my prayers, and look and see the sacrifice on my behalf. So it's somebody coming with a sin offering is to come with a broken and contrite heart, as Psalm 51 says. And some would offer a memorial offering atop that sin offering as a plea for God to remember his good promises to forgive sin. And we see how this would fit what we read here in this psalm, as David perhaps is giving a literal memorial offering in the place of God's worship at the temple or tabernacle in his day. And we see how the words of Psalm 38 is David calling out and pleading for mercy amidst his sin. This psalm breaks down neatly into three sections. You have the first section, verse 1 through 8, which we will call physical and mental anguish of sin. And then you have a second section, verse 9 through 14, which we will call loneliness in the midst of sin. And then we have the third section, verse 15 through 22, the presence of God as comfort in the midst of sin. So we'll look at those three sections today, verse 1 through 8. The first section, physical and mental anguish of sin. Verse 2, God has brought calamity upon David for his sin. And then verse 3 through 8 seems to indicate there is physical sickness that has come upon David. Verse 3, no soundness in my flesh, no health in my bones. Verse 5, my wounds stink and fester. Verse 7, my sides are filled with burning. We, of course, don't know what the sickness is because it is clear, but it is clear to David that he is suffering because of his sin, this physical ailment, this sickness that has afflicted his body. He is convinced and knows is a result of his sin. Now, we know for certain that from places in Scripture, most famously Job, we know that physical sickness is not always the direct result of sin. In fact, most times we can say it is not, but that doesn't mean that it is never the result of sin. And we could even say a lot of times it is the result of sin when we think of sort of the natural effects of, say, a sinful lifestyle. Somebody who doesn't take care of themselves, somebody eats who drinks excessively, is going to have physical ailments, and that is the result of a sinful lifestyle. So there's different ways of seeing the effects of sin on the body. There is sort of sin that, sort of a calamity that God might supernaturally bring upon somebody. Maybe not supernaturally is the right word, but sort of mysteriously, or just natural sinful lifestyles leading to physical ailments. But either way, David is feeling the pain and suffering of his sin and is crying out to the Lord. And I just want to share with you what James Montgomery Boyce, I think, gives good advice here. 3 good questions we should ask ourselves when severe suffering enters into our life, whether it's physical sickness or whatever kind of suffering enters our life. And he asks these 3 questions. They were a benefit to my soul, and I hope to yours as well. First, he says, first question, have I sinned or gotten off the track of obedience to what I know I should be doing? And is this setback God's way of getting me back on track and into fellowship with him? Second question, is God using this to trim off some rough edges of my personality and develop a more Christ-like character in me? And then third question, is God using my suffering as a stage upon which his name and wisdom may be glorified? Is it a place for me to show that I love him for who he is, entirely apart from whatever material and physical benefits he may have given me? So I think those 3 questions are helpful questions to consider in the days of our suffering, our pain. It's not that our suffering is always going to be have a direct correlation to sin, but all suffering is a reminder of the fall which has been brought about by sin. your sin and my sin. And so it is a time of sober reflection about our own lives. It couldn't be a very good time for us to reorient maybe those areas in our life that have gone astray from the path of the Lord. And suffering can be a very pointed way God gets our attention to sanctify us and to consider our life before Him and to set our house in order. Second section, 9 through 14, loneliness in the midst of sin. Verse 9, David takes comfort in the fact that his longing and suffering is before God, that God sees his miserable estate. And then he goes into how both his friends and his enemies have no regard for his condition. Verse 11, my friends and companions stand aloof from my plague, and my nearest kin stand far off. That word for plague has correlation to the idea of leprosy. And what was common within the camp of Israel is one had leprosy, they had to be severed from the covenant community for a time. And so their friends, the Israelites, would not come near them, not seek to touch them. And it seems that here is David being treated perhaps someone who has leprosy, someone who's considered unclean and separated from the covenant community. Verse 12, enemies are using his miserable condition as opportunity to destroy him. Verse 13 through 14, David has no strength, no voice to defend himself. Derek Kidner writes on this section, he says, it is ironical that the more a person needs human support, the less he naturally attracts to it. It is the gospel that has most changed this. Say that again. It is ironical that the more a person needs human support, the less he naturally attracts to it. It is the gospel that has most changed this. We think of Matthew 25. What is the difference between the sheep and the goats in the end? The sheep are the ones that go and meet the afflicted in prison, go and meet those who are sick and who are poor, that go near to people in their greatest time of need. The goats are those that don't visit those in prison, that don't see the afflicted and meet them in their suffering and in their pain. They distance themselves from them in their sad state. But note here in our psalm, it's not visiting people who are poor, innocent victims. I think of the animal shelters and the poor, innocent dog with the one eye. And of course, all our hearts break for that dog. But here in Psalm 38, it's a guilty David. It's visiting David who is receiving his just deserts for his sin. I'm not visiting him. He's getting what he deserves. I'm not going to waste my time with a man or a woman such as that. But gospel living is being a presence in the midst of sin-sick people who are suffering. And Matthew 25 says it very pointedly. What separates true Christians from those that just proclaim Christ are those that draw near to the sin-sick, to the poor, to the hurting, pray with them, meet them, give them the physical touch that they need. And that is Christ-like behavior, and even one that will be a litmus test in the judgment day. Third and finally, third section, verse 15 through 22, the presence of God as comfort. In the midst of David's loneliness, what is it that he pants for but for the presence of God? Now note the difference between verse 13 through 14 and verse 15. Verse 13 through 14, he doesn't answer his unjust friends and enemies, but verse 15, he only answers to God. Think of what David is saying here. Amidst the utter anguish that God has placed on him, God is still seen as most merciful and gracious, and it's fallen mankind that is the beast. I've mentioned it before because I think it's so striking. David in, 2 Samuel 24, the end of 2 Samuel, he's committed the sin of asking for the census, and he's asked out of 3 different kinds of judgment, which ones will he take? And he says, place me in the hands of the Lord, for in the Lord there is mercy. Don't put me in the hands of man, because man is wicked and evil. Man is a beast. And so here is the irony of it all. God, as he says at the beginning of the psalm, is the one who is the source of all his suffering, yet he would still rather be in the hands of the Lord, who is merciful, than in his unjust, fallen friends and enemies. That's quite striking. I hope you see it there. Verse 16 through 20, David pleads for God to come and save him. David is pleading for mercy. He's about to fall, which could mean die. I am sorry for my sin, but this is too much for me, is essentially what he's saying. He is weighed down by what is against him, and he is crying out for God to be merciful. He says in verse 20, those who render me evil for good accuse me because I follow after good. Now, that seems maybe a bit strange for us in this psalm that is a penitential psalm. He's confessing his sin, his foolishness. Yet here in verse 20, he says he follows after good. Is there a contradiction here? How can you follow after good, even in the midst of your sin? Well, who is it that confesses sin? I actually spoke about this today in communicants class with Joe Morrow. Who is it that confesses sin? It's the one who is seeking to live a good life in accordance with the goodness of God. And when he sees that he has gone off course, he is guilty, and he confesses sin to the Lord, seeks his forgiveness, and seeks to endeavor after a new obedience. The one who is not seeking after good never confesses sin, because they never see sin. They don't care about sin. They don't care about holiness and being more like the God who has saved and redeemed them. So it is even in the very confession itself, ironically, that shows that he is following after good. 1 John 1:10. If we say we have not sinned, we make God a liar, and his word is not in us. And then David closes in verse 21 through 22. Do not forsake me, O Lord. O my God, be not far from me. Make haste to help me, O Lord, my salvation. David's sin and the effects of his sin has drawn his eyes to be solely on God as his only hope of salvation. And as verse 15 says, he waits on him. Well, I think just to close, this idea of waiting, which is really the theme that we get in verse 15 through 22, think of David's life and how it was really an education on waiting for the Lord. David has Samuel come up to him when he's a teenager, a youth, and he's told he's going to be the king over Israel. Yet it's several decades later that he's actually coronated as king. He's on the run from Saul. And even after Saul is killed by the Philistines, David is only coronated as king in Hebron over Judah and not all Israel. And he has to wait another 7 years before he is king over all Israel. During his son Absalom's rebellion, David showed that he was content to wait on God to restore him to the throne. Kidner again writes, David's fugitive years, his Hebron period, and his attitude to Absalom's revolt all proved the sincerity of his prayer. David was trained in the school of waiting. I ask you the question tonight, are you? Am I? Boyce again writes this, someone has said that 100 years ago, if someone was taking a trip and missed the stagecoach, well, that was all right. He would get it next month. Today we get impatient if we miss one turn of the revolving door. We live in a world that is conducive to impatience. Our day-to-day lives do not train us as David's whole life trained him for patience. And so our day-to-day lives should be training grounds for us to frame a waiting spirit and disposition toward the Lord. As it has been said, if you're not faithful in the little things, how can you hope to be faithful in the big things when they come your way? If you're not training your heart in the little things, the day-to-day things of your life, to be patient and to wait, when that calamity hits, whether it's due to sin or whatever it might be, you shouldn't expect that you're going to extend godly patience to the Lord in that season as well. So try and put certain habits and routines into your day-to-day practices. It can be little things. It's little for me. I'm really, really hungry. When I'm really, really hungry, what do you want to do? You just want to go to that food and eat, right? Take a deep breath and say a prayer. And don't just say, Lord, bless this food. Right? Say a prayer, and say a prayer that truly engages your heart. That's very tiny, but just tiny little things that are training and orienting your heart toward a patient and waiting spirit. All right, let's go to our Lord in prayer. Any prayer requests for this evening? Yes.